Hi everyone, and welcome to Week 6, where we will be discussing federal and state early childhood programs. The types of federal legislation and programs that we will be talking about today include the Economic Opportunity Act, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, No Child Left Behind, and the Every Student Succeeds Act. Please note these are only a handful of federal legislation and programs, but these are the main programs and pieces of legislation that we will be talking about this week. So first up is the Economic Opportunity Act of 1964, and as the title implies, this act was put into place in 1964 as part of President Johnson's War on Poverty. And this was really one of the first social programs that was put into place that provided any type of federal support and advocacy for early childhood education. This social program was meant to promote health, education, and welfare of specifically individuals and families from low socioeconomic or low-income backgrounds. And this legislation provided the beginning of Head Start. And this act was actually reauthorized in 1981 as the Head Start Act of 1981. After that, we have the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, or ESEA, and this piece of legislation provided funding for elementary and secondary education for children from low-income families. So first you had provisions for Head Start, providing social programs for young children who were from low-income families, and then this legislation really hits on above Head Start and into elementary, middle, and high schools. One of the most important parts of this act is Title I, and this is something you have probably heard of, but Title I provides funding for additional academic support for children who receive free or reduced price school lunches. A lot of times when we talk about education policy and education legislation, the way that low income is measured is by the number or the percentage of students who are receiving free and reduced price school lunches, which is measured by the federal poverty line. So an example of funding that comes from Title I would be any type of supplemental instruction in reading and math, which might come in the form of tutoring. Tutoring programs are an often used way that Title I funds are used, as well as after-school and summer programs for enrichment. And there's a pretty good chance, especially if you are in a rural area, that you will be likely to teach in a Title I school if you are teaching in a school setting. After ESEA, we move on to No Child Left Behind, which was actually just a reauthorization of ESEA in 2001, which transitioned into this giant piece of legislation that we now know as NCLB, designed to improve student achievement and school performance. This piece of legislation had particular wide sweeping impacts to our educational system because it really called for increased accountability for states and districts. It really emphasized the use of state standards for competency and for achievement. It implemented widespread comprehensive standardized testing. So at certain grade levels, all schools nationwide were expected to implement standardized tests, and those scores are what helped to either show that schools were meeting proficiency or were not meeting proficiency. And if schools were not meeting proficiency, then after so many years, the federal government had some systems in place to come in and provide some support and implement some policies that were pretty strict regarding teaching and the types of material that was being taught in schools. No Child Left Behind also really emphasized rigorous teaching methods that were evidence-based and demonstrated effectiveness in raising achievement scores. And lastly, we move on to our current authorization, which is the Every Student Succeeds Act, or as you might hear it referred to, ESSA. This replaced NCLB in 2015 as another reauthorization of ESEA. We see that happening a lot in education policy. A lot of these acts are reauthorized throughout time, and a lot of times are given a new name, so it can be a little bit confusing to keep track of. But ESSA really provides a little bit more flexible approach to testing and accountability for states. Instead of the federal government having the majority of control, states have a responsibility for setting high standards for graduation, for targeting any resources to schools that are falling behind. So this is usually measured by the lowest performing 5% of schools. States also have the power to develop their own systems for school improvement. So states actually have developed their own improvement plans and submit those to the federal government for approval. Annual assessments and reports are still required. There has been call for increased access to high-quality preschool, and this piece of legislation also called for some new resources to test practices that increase positive student outcomes, not just those achievement scores. So we're really focused on student outcomes and not necessarily outcomes just in the measure of standardized testing. Moving on to think about Head Start programs. This is one of the main federal programs that we think of when we think about early childhood education and early childhood special education. And we're going to talk about Head Start and Early Head Start specifically. Head Start is a national program that promotes school readiness by providing really comprehensive services to children and families from low socioeconomic backgrounds. So again, this is targeted towards families who are low income and low socioeconomic status. And Head Start programs are funded by federal grants that are provided directly to local public and private agencies. Services include things like language and literacy skills, cognition, physical development, health and well-being, social emotional development, and learning approaches. So it's not just an education program, but it's really a comprehensive set of services that is put in place in order to best support these families to get their children ready to enter school and close any potential gaps that could exist due to some income differences between these families and families from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. In order to be eligible for Head Start, children must be between 3 and 5 years old, and income is determined according to the federal poverty line. So this line shifts a little bit each year as determined by the federal government, but 90% of children enrolled in these programs must meet the income eligibility, so they must be below the federal poverty line. And there's also another stipulation that at least 10% of enrollment in Head Start programs must include children with disabilities. A lot of times we see this limit being exceeded by, several percentage points in order to give young children who have disabilities a little bit of a, no pun intended, head start before they enter school as well. Then there's also a program called Early Head Start, which is funded in a similar way by federal grants. And this program is another comprehensive set of services for low-income families, but this provides year-round services. And services are provided to pregnant women and infants and toddlers from ages birth to 3. So Early Head Start happens earlier than Head Start, and this really targets our infants and toddlers, as well as pregnant women and women right after they have children, so that, again, we can make sure that we're supporting families from low-income backgrounds to make sure that when they get to school, they feel supported and that their children really have a chance to be on closer to equal footing as compared to typical peers or peers from higher income levels. Again, the purpose is to improve development across domains, including physical, social, emotional, and intellectual development. And the last thing I want to touch on in today's video is this idea of learning standards, both federal and state standards, and why we have these standards. You can see here the progression of how we got to where we are with the Common Core state standards. But everything really kicked off with the standards movement going all the way back to 1983. And there was a U.S. Department of Education report called A Nation at Risk that looked at our schools and sent the message that our schools were failing our children, that there were huge, widespread disparities between students in one state and another state, or students from high-income backgrounds and low-income backgrounds. And so we go through a progression of legislation that brings us to where we are today with ESSA. And we really are seeing that the purpose of standards now is to ensure college and career readiness, with states being in control of these standards. And in order to really make sure that students are college and career ready, that's sort of a buzz phrase being used. That's really going back to the purpose of education in the U.S., like we talked about earlier, which is to support a well-developed workforce and to support our economic stability. Common Core state standards that are in place are benchmarks for math and English that provide uniform guidelines for what students will know and do. So states do have the option to choose whether to adopt these standards and in what form. It's a state-led effort, but it really is meant to make sure that students in West Virginia, for example, are getting similar information and being able to know and do similar things as students in New Jersey or Virginia or California, while also letting the states have some flexibility in what that looks like for their area. The book also talks a little bit about the achievement gap, and I'd like to address that there is an existing achievement gap between scores of standard achievement for students from different racial backgrounds, from different socioeconomic backgrounds. But I would challenge you to frame this as an opportunity gap and think about the ways that we can provide increased access to high quality early education to prevent this achievement gap. And things that we can do are providing access to high quality programs, training an effective teaching workforce, and making sure that we're providing parent support when needed. So programs like Head Start and Early Head Start really do play a critical role in supporting children early and helping them be set up to succeed later on in their school careers. This type of federal funding, legislation, and programs has immense implications for teaching. And some of these implications include things like intentional teaching, curriculum alignment, data-driven instruction, and professional development. Since this week's reading is a little bit heavy with legislation and all of this stuff, I'm going to hold off on talking about these explicitly until next week, but look forward to learning more about intentional teaching and all of these different strategies that this legislation impacts. You will be looking at some curriculum assignment stuff during the participation activity this week. Which leads us right into our wrap-up and reminders. Please continue to check Blackboard frequently every week so that you are checking the checklist that is in the module to let you know everything that you need to do for the week. Again, there are participation activities randomly assigned. This week, that looks like a small group discussion board. And you should be posting an initial discussion post by Thursday and then a reply to your peers by Sunday. I hope you have a great week.